Hello, I'm Maureen O'Donnell, Manager of Business in the Community's Responsible Business Certification Scheme, otherwise known as the MARC. Since 2000, Business in the Community have been delivering on our purpose, which is to bring about a low-carbon economy and an inclusive society where everyone thrives. I'm just one of a team of multidisciplinary experts, and we work with a network of members, bringing them together in a variety of ways to progress the environment, economic, social, and governance agenda of sustainability. And then we also partner with 250 businesses through our social impact programs. Here are our members, over 115 of Ireland's largest brands, all working to have a positive ESG impact. And here are our MARC certified companies. The MARC provides a framework to embed environmental, social, and governance into your business model. It gives you ESG credentials for new bids, it demonstrates leadership amongst your peers, and just like any ISO certification, which is the process that we follow, it provides you with a mechanism for continuous improvement in this space. And most importantly in this case, MARC certification will help you establish a management system structure, and a management system structure can be used to comply with upcoming directives. Now, there are several directives present in most people's mind today, the CSRD being one of them. The one this presentation addresses is the CSDDD, otherwise known as the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, the CSDD, the CSDDD, or the CSD cubed. There are a lot of names that this directive is being referred to by. Today we'll discuss the what, the when, the why, the who of the CSDDD, and I'll also provide you with the steps to compliance. And then I'll finish up by explaining that everything I've just told you is subject to change because most of the key points are still in negotiation. So we'll also go through the trilogue discussion points, which are those negotiation points. So why is there a CSDDD? Well, it's because of the numbers on this slide. 37% of EU global businesses conduct environmental and human rights due diligence. Now that might sound good, but if you flip that around, it's nearly 2/3 don't. And less than 1 in 5 cover the entire supply chain. That's according to a 2020 EU Commission study. So voluntary standards aren't resulting in substantive human rights and environmental change. And in order for the EU to transition to a climate neutral and a green economy aligned with the Green Deal and deliver on the SDGs, due diligence has to happen. The intention is to drive behavior change. And to me, this is really important because we can't keep thinking the same way we've been thinking and solve the climate crisis or end human rights abuses. We've got to think differently in order to act differently. Thinking differently is going to lead companies to frame their business decisions through an environmental and a human rights lens. They're going to have to in order to be able to mitigate risk across their value chains. And that hopefully is going to lead to greater impact and resilience. So why this particular instrument? Why wasn't the CSRD enough? We need the CSDDD because it's hard to identify and mitigate human rights and environmental risks. It's really that simple. We've been working in this space for over 20 years, and while our companies are making a concerted effort, even they're finding it difficult because global value chains are complex and in most cases far away from where the product is sold. It's hard to perform due diligence from great distances. This results in a lack of reliable data, and the CSDDD, by forcing due diligence, is going to help develop reliable data. It'll also help to provide legal clarity that voluntary standards just can't. This may include legal recourse where the victims of harm can be compensated. For a lot of our members, there are people and sometimes teams dedicated to trying to mitigate risk and minimize harm. But again, it's under a voluntary scheme. The CSDDD will mandate that all large companies consider the unintended consequences of, for example, a €5 t-shirt that was made with unsustainable materials using forced labor. There are also a number of countries implementing their own version of this, and the CSDDD will, at least for the EU anyway, harmonize those efforts. And what we saw with the CSRD was, once that got over the line, suddenly there was a flurry of alignment activities with it. So the issues most companies complain about, which is having to comply with loads of different standards, will be reduced by having this one mega standard, if you will. As I said before, the bottom line is that voluntary actions haven't fixed the problem, so the EU is legislating a solution. But legislation has to be just one part of a wider effort to drive change. Here's one example of that wider effort from the World Benchmarking Alliance, using the automotive industry transition to electric vehicles. In order to make the changeover to wide-scale electric vehicle production, there were a few, and the WBA calls it external forces, that needed to be in place. First, there had to be widespread consensus that the combustion engine had to be phased out if we were going to meet our climate targets. Then, new competitors, namely Tesla, entered the market and started to build market share. Then, government started making investments in charging infrastructures. And then finally, regulators started proposing regulations to prohibit the sale of new cars with combustion engines in the future. The EU ban on petrol and diesel cars from 2035 is an example of that. All these different elements of the puzzle came together to drive behavior change towards electric vehicles. The point in this example is that legislation is just one tool in the toolbox to drive behavior change. So, what solution is the EU legislating? Well, the CSDDD requires due diligence to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for adverse impact on human rights and the environment. It includes obligations for companies, but also obligations for directors. And then, as I said, it provides legal recourse for victims under a civil liability regime. It applies to the full value chain, all the way from design to end of life. For certain companies, it mandates a climate transition plan. And then, as I said before, it harmonizes country-specific legislation. Just to note, the CSDDD is complementary to a number of other directives. It complements the CSRD by introducing rules on actual or potential adverse impacts to the value chain. It also introduces rules on actions taken and the result of those actions to prevent, mitigate, or remediate impacts. It also complements the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the SFDR, and the Taxonomy Regulation by imposing obligations on companies to provide data and information on human rights and environmental value chain risks. And then, since 80 to 90% of environmental harm from EU companies comes from value chains outside the EU, the CSDDD complements the Environmental Liability Directive through the proposed civil liability provisions. There are a number also of human rights directives that the CSDDD complements. It's also in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, and then also the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Business Conduct. So here's where we're at in the timeline. We're in the trilogue negotiations between the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. And once that concludes, then the final text will be adopted into law. Now you'll note the CSRD, which complements the CSDDD, entered into force in January. The goal is to have the CSDDD into law prior to the European elections in April, but apparently things are taking a little bit longer than planned in the trilogues. There's a number of sticking points that I'll get to. Who is the CSDDD applicable to? Well, currently around 13,000 EU companies and 4,000 non-EU companies with the profile listed in this slide. Very large companies, which is 500 employees plus and a net turnover of 150 million, or smaller companies, which would be 250 employees and a net turnover of 40 million in these high-risk sectors you see listed on the slide. And of course, even if you're not in the EU, you're still going to have to comply if you meet the thresholds outlined in Group 1 and Group 2 and you do business in the EU. And if you don't see your company in this profile, don't breathe a sigh of relief just yet, because similar to the CSRD, the CSDDD takes a value chain approach. So if I'm Giant Corp making mushroom risotto and I need to mitigate my supply chain risk, and you, my supplier, Medium Corp, are providing me mushrooms using forced labor, then you can bet that you're going to become a focus of my risk mitigation strategy. And even if you're ethically sourcing my mushrooms for me, you might still have to do some extra work to prove it to me. So just because you're not in scope doesn't mean that you're not going to have to comply, if that makes sense. If you are in scope for the CSDDD, here are your 6 easy steps to compliance. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because they're not really going to be easy, but at least they can be structured. They follow a management system approach. First, starting with an intention is always a good idea, so you can integrate that intention into your policies and your board governance. Then you have to identify the actual and potential adverse impacts across your value chain, and that's going to be a significant job of work right there. Once you do that, then it's a matter of preventing or mitigating potential impacts and ending or minimizing the actual ones. Here's where I think the behavior change comes into play, because we can't keep making the same business decisions and comply with the CSDDD. Actually, you have to think differently about the environment and human rights and how those issues affect your business and how your business affects those issues. You have to set up a complaints procedure, and once the structures are in place and operational, then you're assessing the effectiveness. Oftentimes, this is where auditing can help. Where there are issues, then corrective action plans can be put in place as part of the remediation strategy. And then, of course, you're communicating. There's a disclosure requirement as well, either through the same structures as the CSRD if you're in scope for that, or on your website. So that's all going to be a lot of work. You might be thinking that it would be cheaper just not to comply. Possibly. It depends on how the sanctions are implemented. And here was what was proposed in the original CSDDD text. Fines and compliance orders, a civil liability regime, and linkage to variable performance for directors. Now, that may come into play or that may not. As I said at the start, pretty much everything that I've just told you on this slide and all the ones before it is subject to change based on the trilogue conversations. Here are the sticking points being debated in the trilogues. The trilogues are meetings between representatives of the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission. And their purpose is to reach a provisional agreement on legislative text that works for both the Council and the Parliament. Now, there's other issues being discussed in the trilogues too, but these issues on this slide in particular are proving to be really thorny. The trilogues are ongoing. There are more happening this year, and unless something changes, they're likely going to extend into 2024, as I said before, which could possibly delay agreement past the European elections next year. Liability and sanctions haven't been agreed. They could get stricter, like product sanctions, or they could get looser, like administrative enforcement and a requirement of proof of fault. And just to note that country-specific legislation similar to the CSDDD has already been enacted in a few EU countries. France led this back in 2017. They've got a civil liability scheme in their legislation, and what they noted is at the start of it, it was relatively quiet, but after a few years, the number of cases brought forward by activist groups in particular under the legislation's increased. So there's a very real possibility that companies would get sued under this legislation should this element remain in it. Also then, how far does the value chain extend? Does it extend to product use, or does it exclude most downstream activities? The company threshold is also debated. That could increase to be fully in line with CSRD, or it could drop to even larger companies. Will financial institutions be in scope? And if so, at the EU level, or are member states going to get to decide who's in scope and who's not? And then how big of a role should directors really have? And related to that, will individuals within companies have their bonuses affected? Maybe so, maybe not. As I said, the trilogues are currently underway, and they've been negotiating a number of points. Most of what they've agreed is kind of at the shallow end of the pool so far. And it's reported that with these issues in particular, they're fairly entrenched in their positions. So unless something big changes, it's possible, maybe even likely, that they're going to continue into 2024, pushing the CSDDD adoption into EU law past the European elections. It's all still really up in the air right now as of November 2023. And I will leave you with helpful information from this slide and also an offer. If you want help establishing the management systems that you're going to need to have in place to comply with CSRD and CSDDD, feel free to contact me. My email is listed on the bottom of this slide. Thanks very much. Have a good day.